The most patriotic man in Hollywood had never fired a shot in anger for his country. John Wayne stood on the dusty Arizona set of Rio Lobo on a blazing afternoon in September 1969, wearing the uniform of a Civil War colonel and carrying the moral authority of a man who had spent 30 years teaching America what courage looked like on screen. But the words that were about to come out of his mouth would expose the most painful contradiction in his legendary career. The man who had become the symbol of American military heroism had spent World War II safely in Hollywood studios while better men died on foreign battlefields. And Dean Martin, his co-star and longtime friend, was about to remind him of that fact in the most devastating way possible. The confrontation that would shatter their friendship and redefine both men's legacies began with a single word that Wayne should never have spoken: coward. It ended with a truth that Wayne had spent decades trying to bury beneath layers of cinematic bravado and patriotic performance. What happened between those two moments would teach both men that some wounds never heal, and that the most dangerous enemy of a manufactured hero is someone who knows the difference between real courage and Hollywood courage. John Wayne's relationship with his own military service, or lack thereof, was the defining psychological burden of his life. Born Marion Morrison in Iowa, he had grown up during the Great Depression, dreaming of heroism, adventure, and the chance to prove himself as a man worthy of the rugged American ideal he would later embody on screen. But when World War II came, Wayne made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He stayed in Hollywood instead of joining the fight. The official reasons were compelling enough. Wayne was 26 when Pearl Harbor was attacked, married with children, and classified as 3A deferred for dependency reasons by his draft board. Republic Pictures, which had him under contract, successfully argued that his work making morale-boosting films was essential to the war effort. But the real reason Wayne didn't serve was simpler and more painful. He was afraid that military service would interrupt the career momentum he had worked so hard to build. He chose Hollywood over heroism, and it was a choice that tortured him every day for the rest of his life. While Wayne was making movies about brave soldiers, his Hollywood contemporaries were actually becoming them. Jimmy Stewart flew bombing missions over Germany. Clark Gable served as an aerial gunner. Henry Fonda enlisted in the Navy and served in the Pacific. These men returned from the war with the authentic experience of combat, the brotherhood of shared sacrifice, and the moral authority that comes from having put service before self. Wayne returned from the war with box office receipts and the growing suspicion that he had taken the coward's path when his country needed him most. Dean Martin's relationship with military service was completely different. Dean had been too young for World War II, turning 18 just as the war was ending, and too old for Korea by the time that conflict began. He had never claimed to be a war hero, never wrapped himself in the flag, never built his career on military valor, but he had friends who had served real soldiers, real Marines, real sailors who had seen real combat and carried real scars. Dean understood the difference between earned authority and performed authority, between real courage and cinematic courage, and he had watched John Wayne build a career on claiming the moral high ground of patriotism while never having paid the price that real patriots paid. The tension between the two men had been building throughout the filming of Rio Lobo. Wayne, at 62, was feeling the weight of his years and the pressure of maintaining his image as America's definitive action hero. Dean, at 52, was secure in his own identity and increasingly impatient with what he saw as Wayne's sanctimonious posturing about American values and military virtue. The explosion was inevitable. It just needed the right spark. That spark came during a break in filming when the conversation turned to the anti-war protests that were sweeping American college campuses. Wayne, dressed in his Civil War colonel's uniform, was holding court with several members of the cast and crew, delivering his standard lecture about patriotism, duty, and respect for the flag. "These college kids don't understand what this country stands for," Wayne was saying, his distinctive voice carrying the authority of a man who had never doubted his own righteousness. "They've never had to fight for anything. They've never had to put their lives on the line for their beliefs. They think freedom is free, that someone else will always do the fighting while they sit around smoking marijuana and burning draft cards." Several crew members nodded in agreement. Wayne's opinions about patriotism and military service carried enormous weight in Hollywood, not just because of his star power, but because of the dozens of war films he had made that had shaped American understanding of what military heroism looked like. Dean Martin was sitting slightly apart from the group, reading a newspaper and smoking a cigarette. He had heard this speech before, many times, and it never failed to irritate him. not because he disagreed with honoring military service, but because he found it hypocritical, coming from someone who had never actually provided any. "What do you think, Dean?" Wayne called out, apparently deciding that Dean's silence indicated agreement with his position. "You've seen what's happening to this country. Young men refusing to serve, spitting on the flag, disrespecting everything our soldiers have died for. Don't you think it's time someone stood up and said enough is enough?" Dean looked up from his newspaper, his expression unreadable. "I think people have a right to their opinions, John, even when those opinions make other people uncomfortable." Wayne's eyes narrowed. He sensed something in Dean's tone that suggested disagreement, and Wayne didn't handle disagreement well when it came to matters of patriotism. "Are you saying you support these protesters, these kids who are too cowardly to serve their country?" The word cowardly hung in the desert air like a challenge. Dean folded his newspaper carefully, stubbed out his cigarette, and looked directly at Wayne. "I'm saying that calling someone a coward is a serious accusation, John. You better be sure you're qualified to make that judgment." Wayne stood up from his director's chair, his 6'4" frame imposing even without the added authority of his costume. "I think I'm qualified to recognize cowardice when I see it, Dean. I've spent my career portraying men who had the courage to fight for what they believed in." Dean's response was delivered in a voice so quiet that everyone present had to strain to hear it, but every word carried the weight of absolute truth. "John, you spent World War II making movies in Hollywood while real men died. At least I never pretended to be a soldier." The silence that followed was complete and devastating. Every person on that set understood that they had just witnessed something that couldn't be taken back, something that had permanently altered the relationship between two of Hollywood's biggest stars. Wayne's face went through a series of changes, from confusion to understanding to rage, to something that looked almost like shame. The accusation hit him in the place where he was most vulnerable, the secret wound that he had spent 30 years trying to heal through cinematic performance. "I served my country by making films that supported the war effort," Wayne said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I boosted morale. I sold war bonds. You stayed safe," Dean interrupted, his voice still quiet, but now carrying an edge that everyone present could feel. "While Jimmy Stewart was flying bombing missions over Germany, you were on a soundstage in Burbank. While Clark Gable was an aerial gunner over Europe, you were having lunch at the Brown Derby. While Henry Fonda was serving in the Pacific, you were worried about your box office numbers." Each comparison was a knife thrust, because each one was true, and everyone present knew it. Wayne had indeed stayed in Hollywood while his contemporaries had gone to war, and his subsequent career as the cinematic embodiment of military heroism was built on a foundation of avoided service. Wayne's response was desperate and angry. "That's easy for you to say, Dean. You were too young for World War II and too old for Korea. You never had to make that choice. You never had to choose between your career and your country." Dean stood up slowly, his movement deliberate and controlled. When he spoke, his voice carried the cold authority of someone who had just decided to end a friendship that had lasted 20 years. "You're right, John. I never had to make that choice, but if I had, I know which one I would have made. And so do you." The truth of that statement was visible in Wayne's eyes. Everyone present could see that Dean had struck the deepest nerve possible, the place where Wayne's greatest insecurity lived. The man who had built his career on projecting strength and moral certainty was being forced to confront the fact that when his generation's defining test of courage had arrived, he had chosen safety over service. Wayne tried to recover his moral authority through bluster. "I don't have to justify my war record to you or anyone else. I served my country in my own way, and I'm proud of the contribution I made." Dean's response was swift and final. "Your war record, John? What war record? Making movies isn't a war record. Playing soldiers isn't serving your country. And lecturing other people about patriotism when you avoided the one chance you had to actually be patriotic isn't moral authority, it's moral bankruptcy." The brutality of Dean's assessment left Wayne speechless. He stood there in his Civil War colonel's uniform, surrounded by people who had just watched his carefully constructed image of military virtue get systematically dismantled by someone who had never claimed to be a war hero but understood the difference between authentic and performed courage. The director, Howard Hawks, tried to defuse the situation. "Gentlemen, perhaps we should—" "No," Dean said, his eyes never leaving Wayne's face. "John wanted to talk about cowardice. Let's talk about it. Real cowardice isn't refusing to serve in a war you don't believe in. Real cowardice is avoiding service in a war you do believe in, then spending the rest of your life pretending you're a hero. Wayne's response was barely audible. I was supporting my family. I had responsibilities. So did Stuart. So did Gable. So did Fonda. They found a way to serve anyway. They found a way to put their country before their careers. They found a way to be the men they played on screen. The comparison was devastating because it was accurate. Wayne's contemporaries had indeed found ways to serve despite their Hollywood careers, and their post-war performances in military roles carried an authenticity that Wayne's performances, no matter how skilled, could never match. Dean picked up his script and started walking toward his trailer. As he passed Wayne, he paused for one final observation. You know what the real tragedy is, John. You could have been a real hero instead of just playing one. But you chose the safe path, and you've been trying to make up for it ever since. The problem is, no amount of flag-waving and patriotic speeches can change what you did when it actually mattered. Wayne stood alone on the set as Dean walked away, surrounded by cast and crew members who were suddenly very interested in anything that wasn't the expression on the Duke's face. The moral authority that Wayne had built his entire persona around had just been exposed as hollow performance, and everyone present had witnessed the exposure. The remainder of the filming of Rio Lobo was conducted in an atmosphere of professional courtesy that barely concealed the personal animosity between the two stars. Wayne and Dean spoke only when necessary for their scenes, and their off-camera interactions were limited to the bare minimum required to complete the film. But the real damage wasn't to their personal relationship, it was to Wayne's carefully constructed self-image. Dean's words had forced Wayne to confront the central contradiction of his life. He had become America's symbol of military virtue, despite having avoided military service when it was actually required. The guilt and shame that Wayne had suppressed for 25 years came flooding back, triggered by someone who had the moral clarity to speak the truth that everyone else had been too polite or too intimidated to say. Wayne never spoke to Dean Martin again after Rio Lobo wrapped. He avoided social gatherings where Dean might be present, and he declined offers to work with him on future projects. The friendship that had survived Hollywood politics, career competition, and personal differences couldn't survive the truth about Wayne's war record. In his later years, Wayne became increasingly defensive about his military service, often bringing up the topic in interviews and explaining at length how his film work had supported the war effort. But those who knew him well said that Dean's words had wounded him in a way that never healed. Wayne had spent his career building an image of himself as the embodiment of American military virtue, and Dean had reminded him that images and reality aren't the same thing. Dean, for his part, never spoke publicly about the confrontation. When asked about his relationship with Wayne, he would simply say that they had creative differences, and leave it at that. But friends said that Dean felt the incident had been necessary, even if it was painful. In Dean's view, Wayne had been trading on a moral authority he hadn't earned, and someone needed to point out that the Emperor had no clothes. The story of the confrontation spread through Hollywood like wildfire, though always in whispers and always without attribution. It became part of the industry's oral tradition, a reminder that even the biggest stars weren't immune to having their carefully constructed images challenged by someone with the courage to speak uncomfortable truths. Years later, when both men were dead, film historians would note that Wayne's performances after Rio Lobo carried a different quality, a defensiveness, an overcompensation that suggested he was trying to prove something that he had previously taken for granted. Dean's performances, by contrast, seemed unchanged. He had never built his identity on military virtue, so having exposed someone else's hollow claims hadn't affected his own sense of self. The night John Wayne called Dean Martin a coward, he learned that the most dangerous person to accuse of cowardice is someone who has never claimed to be brave. Dean's response hadn't just humiliated Wayne, it had forced him to confront the difference between playing a hero and being one. And that was a truth that Wayne, despite his considerable talents as an actor, could never learn to perform convincingly. In the end, the confrontation revealed something profound about both men. Wayne had built his career on projecting an image of courage he had never actually demonstrated. Dean had built his career on being authentically himself, which included being honest about his limitations. When those two approaches collided, authenticity triumphed over performance, and the truth proved more powerful than the most carefully constructed legend. The Duke had been dethroned, not by a rival or an enemy, but by a friend who refused to pretend that performed heroism was the same as real heroism. And that was a humiliation that no amount of cinematic bravery could ever erase.